Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. And today we're going to be editing a page nice and easily. So as you can see, this is the meeting DRAC section, which has been updated now and then over time. But as you can see, we're now well past March 2026. So I'm just going to add the San Francisco and nearby areas section into the completed section, which I know a good number of you came out to see me, so that was really cool. So then I can just get rid of that as an upcoming thing because those details aren't so important anymore. The next upcoming opportunity to meet DRAC, however, as you can see, is this, but now there are more speakers, so I can just go into Upload File, hopefully navigate to the right folder containing the relevant image. There it is. And as you can see, it automatically reconfigures to the shape and size of the image. And now I can add a caption, all in the same box, and all ready to go, except, of course, I've just realized that was a link to the tickets for this big debrief conference on June the 6th, so I can just go in and select and say, no, I want this to be a URL, I want this to be a link, and I want to open a new tab, save, and it's all done. And that will literally update on your website. As you can see, the link works perfectly already, all nice and easily done with Squarespace. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Ship prefixes are normally a relatively inoffensive way of telling one ship from another. Occasionally, the spark of some almighty unhinged rants on the internet by people who are presumably applying their face directly to the keyboard, and very occasionally there's even the odd reason discussion about their use. So, what are they? Which navies use them? And why do many historians use prefixes for navies that have themselves never used them or didn't use them at the time? Well, today we're going to focus on the prefixes used to designate a fleet's major warships, as opposed to the ones used for auxiliaries and civilian vessels. Otherwise, we'd be here all week. The easiest part is what they are. They're a short set of characters that signify the initials of a longer title that informs the reader who the owner of the ship about to be named is. Commonly, they're 3 characters long, but 2-character or 4 or 5-character prefixes are not unknown. Some of the best known are from the 2 largest navies of recent history, the US Navy, whose ships currently bear the prefix USS, and the Royal Navy, whose ships carry the prefix HMS. But where did it all begin? Well, it might surprise you to know that formal prefixes for ships are actually a relatively recent innovation. In the medieval period, during the Spanish Armada, and even for most of the Anglo-Dutch wars, there was no formal prefix system. Now, this was for a few reasons. Firstly, many warships of this period were the personal property of the king, the queen, the emperor, etc., basically whoever was in charge. A few were owned by various cities, city-states, or states as a whole, and thus the vessels might be known internally within the country, for example, as a royal ship, but externally they would have a variety of designators, such as insert nationality here ship, i.e. something like English ship or Spanish ship or Hanseatic ship, or a personal ship, i.e. a reference might be to King Philip's ship or King Philip's fleet. But whatever was used could be applied singly, collectively, or be replaced by some other designation. For example, the Henry Grace Adieu flagship of the early Tudor Navy might be found being called King Henry's ship, the English ship, the Great Ship, the Flagship, or any number of other things ahead of its formal name. It could also just be called Grace Dieu. Since warship fleets were relatively small at the time, confusion over names shared between multiple ships was relatively unlikely, especially as many larger ships tended to have names that contained multiple words, and of course these fleets were split between countries that spoke many different languages. Given the largely Catholic nature of Europe up until around about the Tudor period, naming a ship after Mary might be quite common. But most larger ships would not be so simply named. They'd have additional words which would help you distinguish them. For example, the English warship Mary Rose Columbus's flagship La Santa Maria de Immaculada Concepcion, or the French warship Marie la Cordelière. Of course, naming ships for women whose names happened to be Mary but weren't the biblical Mary was also a thing, which does muddy the waters a little bit. But another issue was that fleets at the time often fought not with just the royal or state-owned ships present, but also supported by numerous privately owned ships. And of course, they're all on the same side, but the private vessels would not merit a formal prefix, even had one existed at the time. And here, of course, there was more chance for confusion. For example, the English fleet that mustered to oppose the Armada had at least 2 Unities, 2 Golden Lions, at least 5 ships, including the 2 that had some form of lion in their name, 3 Minions, 2 Revenges, 2 Tigers, and perhaps unsurprisingly 9 ships with some variation of the name Elizabeth. Still, another issue was that any prefix usually includes at least some allusion to ship, and since a ship was a very specific kind of vessel, it just wouldn't work for a lot of the vessels in that period that included their type in their name, with galley, galleon, and bark all being common elements in various ship names. But as warships shifted further away from merchant ships, and so privately owned vessels were less useful in fleets, and fleets not only began to expand but also became more and more under continuous state control, albeit usually with the monarch as the head of state still, the first indications of formal identification prefixes can begin to be found. In the early 1700s, Royal Navy ships began to be referred to as his, or her, as appropriate, Britannic Majesty's ship, often shorted to HBM ship or occasionally HBMS in written form. HM ship was also seen, although less frequently. But in the late 1700s, HM ship, His Majesty's or Her Majesty's ship, or HMS, began to overtake and would eventually supplant HBM ship. Although this did cause another naming convention issue to briefly arise, as the use of ship, either spelt or spoken wholly, allowed for variations like HM sloop or HM bark or HM tender, but also led to an issue where ships began to have the inserted between the prefix and the name. But while HM ship the Goliath might sound roughly correct, HMS the Alexander doesn't quite roll as well. But as HMS got more and more frequent, the got dropped at some point between the Battle of the Nile and the Battle of Trafalgar, as evidenced by the captain's medals that were struck for those 2 battles, and the convention settled into the now familiar HMS Victory, HMS Royal Sovereign, etc., etc. But although HMS was now commonplace, it wasn't actually formally adopted by the Royal Navy until around about 1820, which of course leads to 2 separate dilemmas for the modern historian. Firstly, you have ships that served on both sides of 1820, like Victory herself. She's officially been HMS Victory for most of her long life, but do you then backdate that to the various Revolutionary War and Napoleonic engagements that she fought in? And secondly, do you backdate the prefix still further to older British warships that went out of service before 1820, and if so, how far back do you go? Some style guides suggest not going further back than around 1780 or 1790, which is when HMS began to be the most commonly used prefix, but others will go all the way back to the Restoration period, which was when the Royal Navy both became royal again, having temporarily been a Commonwealth Navy, and officially became part of state apparatus as opposed to the personal property of the monarch. But in whatever case, if we go over to the US Navy, right from the start of that service, there was a sort of prefix system in place, although also unofficial. Much like the Royal Navy, this was US or United States, but with a qualifier. This could be ship, frigate, bark, etc. Although US ship, otherwise known as USS, as a more general term, was mixed in various documents right from the start. The US Navy at the time, and possibly still, also has a habit of dropping the prefix if the ship was not in commission. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, where a ship launches, is commissioned, and then tends to stay in commission until it's taken out of service, this isn't really a problem. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in the age of sail, when ships would very frequently pay off into reserve for substantial portions of time during their careers, then come back out again, then go into reserve again, it would mean they'd officially lose their prefix and then regain it repeatedly. It was actually only in 1907 that President Theodore Roosevelt issued an executive order that stated that all US warships should now have USS, or United States Ship, as their formal prefix. This then leaves us with a general idea about how such things could come about, but now we come on to 4 key points: English translation, general prefix forms, nations which change practice repeatedly, and navies which either didn't or still don't use prefixes at all. Firstly, the English translation issue comes about because with a great number of navies being from countries that have some form of monarchy, either formally or currently in place, it turns out that a large number of them use a prefix that basically means the same thing as the one that the Royal Navy uses, His or Her Majesty's ship. The Imperial German Navy and Austro-Hungarian Navy, for instance, both used SMS, or Seine Majestät Schiff. The Dutch used, and apology to the Dutch listeners, Zijne or Hare Majesteits, depending on whether it's the Queen or King at the time, if I've got the genders the right way around. Sweden likewise uses either Hans or Hennes Majestats Skep, which is His or Her Majesty's ship. And this leads to a bit of a problem, because if you translate them all into English, then, well, almost all the ships in Europe have ships with HMS in their title everywhere. Now, there's no real convention that's uniform when it comes to dealing with this. The Imperial German ships and the Austro-Hungarian ones, for example, just had SMS ported into the English text directly. But most others have been translated, but with some additional character or characters inserted between the H and the M to denote the country of origin. So, for example, the Danish Navy gets translated to HDMS, or His Danish Majesty's Ship, as there turns out they're the only country with a navy, a monarch, and a country name that starts with D. But others, like the Dutch, who of course come from the Netherlands, and the Swedes, which we mentioned earlier, get a second character, usually, but not always, in the lower case. As it turns out, there's at least one other country that has both a navy and a monarch, as well as a name that starts with N or S respectively, so HNLMS or HSWMS. Separately, navies which formed when their home nation was in some way affiliated to the British Empire, or which still have the British King or Queen as their head of state, will tend to put the national initial or initials between the M and the S, hence HMAS or HMCS for Australia and Canada, or HMNZS for New Zealand. Next, we have general prefix forms. Now, obviously, countries with a monarch usually have some version of what we've just talked about, but countries that don't have a monarch, but do have a prefix, will usually go for one of 2 options. Either insert country name here, followed by naval or navy ship, so ANS for Algeria, Algerian Navy ship, or Republic of, country name, ship, so RSS for Republic of Singapore ship, for example. Much as with royal fleets, there is some variation, but those 2 forms are the most commonly found. Now, as a side note, to avoid crowding, it seems that most English-language authors, like with SMS, have been happy to leave the Spanish-speaking world mostly with the prefixes in their original language form, such as ARA for Argentina, which stands for Armada de la República Argentina, or Argentina, which would probably become Argentinian Naval Ship or Argentina Naval Ship in English, which would thus clash with Algeria, and the rather wonderful Peruvian BAP, or Buque Armada Peruana, which would be Peruvian Naval Ship in English, which would then clash with Pakistan, which already has PNS. Then we have nations which at some point have changed system. Germany is a good example, as Imperial Germany, as we've already seen, used SMS, but the Kriegsmarine and its various successors don't officially have prefixes. Now, in these cases, it is, of course, technically correct to use prefixes where they historically were used and then not to do so later, but that brings us on to a 4th point. which is navies which either don't or didn't use ship prefixes at all. Now, in these cases, there is no one strict convention. Some historians prefer simply to not use a prefix at all if it wasn't used historically. Others will use a prefix for every navy, and others will work on a case-by-case basis. Japan, for instance, internally never used prefixes for its ships, but interestingly, externally, i.e. when corresponding with foreign countries, plenty of Japanese documents, as well as foreign press at the time, used HIJMS, or His Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship, the imperial bit because the sovereign of Japan is an emperor, not a king. This is also the form that's used in various Japanese museum ships, including if you visit Mikasa. So if you are going to use a prefix for the ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, then HIJMS is the most appropriate one to use, although IJN is also sometimes used, I suspect simply because it's shorter. Similarly, you'll sometimes see HIRMS used for the Imperial Russian Navy, although IRN and IRS have occasionally been spotted out there in the wild, and Soviet ships are more often left alone without a prefix, but I think that's probably because USSRS just has too many S's. With the Kriegsmarine, it's a rather different matter, as of course we said the Germans did have prefixes but then dropped them. However, two informal prefixes have appeared in a number of good reference works, and then will occasionally pop up in historical documents as well, particularly foreign intelligence reports. KMS, or Kriegsmarine Schiff, Kriegsmarine ship, and DKM, Deutsche Kriegsmarine, German war fleet, technically. While unofficial, there's a reasonable basis for using them if you happen to prefer doing so. And flipping things around, in the time period the channel covers, the Italian Regia Marina does have evidence for the use of RN, or Regia Nave, Royal Ship. But, somewhat like older British and American styles, they can also be found in historical documents using ship-specific designators, like RS for submarines. So in this case, the Regia, or Regio, depending on your spelling, would be the permanent section, the R, and then the S or the N or whatever would be used as a ship designator. But since RN, Regia Nave, is the most suitable catch-all term, it's generally the one you'll see used, although occasionally you'll also see people using RM for Regia Marina, but that is very much in the minority. And then, of course, you come on to countries like France, which have never officially used a prefix, and in that particular case, given how they swung back and forth between Empire and Republic several times, that's probably for the best, because it would leave us with a whole mess of prefixes. These days, of course, many navies that don't officially have a prefix and never have, like the French, get given a insert country name here, followed by ship designator internationally, just to help with ID. So, for example, in NATO formations, French ships are known as FS, insert name of ship. But once again, for historical vessels, in this particular case, MN for Marine Nationale is sometimes used. So, as you can see, who used a prefix, which prefix they used, and when they used it could vary quite significantly. Generally speaking, while it is technically correct to follow the precise usage exactly, many historians, as outlined above, have used semi-official prefixes either just to neaten things up or to help distinguish ships. For example, if you're going to talk about the German ship Scharnhorst, that could prompt the listener to ask, well, which Scharnhorst, as there were 3 warships and 2 ocean liners at a minimum. But if you use SMS Scharnhorst, KMS Scharnhorst, and FGS Scharnhorst, then, well, at least for warships, it's much clearer which one you're actually talking about. For the 2 SS Scharnhorsts, though, you're still left having to specify whether you mean the 1904 or the 1934 version, but that's your problem if you're an ocean liner historian. Likewise, HIJMS Kaga is quite clearly the World War II carrier, as opposed to her modern counterpart. Now, of course, with ships in the US and Royal Navies where they repeatedly use names, well, good luck. And therefore, on this channel, you will tend to see me using the official prefixes where they exist, and then in most other cases for various navies, I'll tend to use whichever unofficial prefix seems to have the most common currency in historical reference works and journals, basically for the same reasons that I just outlined. So I hope that helps a little bit, and see you in the next video.